So I'm going to give an example of a CBPR project related to pesticides from the United States. And I have to say I'm a little intimidated talking about our CBPR with so many CBPR experts in the room, but I'm going to go ahead anyway. I'm going to talk about the Chamaco study. This is a study that we've been doing in California for 18 years now. Just to orient you to where we are, California is the largest agricultural state in the United States, and we grow about half the fruits, vegetables, and nuts for the whole country. California, of course, borders Mexico, and most of the farm workers in our state are immigrants from Mexico. Many of them are undocumented. There's a lot of social justice issues just working with that population and a lot of power dynamics that go into working with that population. We use more than 200,000 pounds of pesticides in California every year, but one of the good things about California is that all pesticide use in agriculture needs to be registered with the State Agricultural Commission. So we actually know every pound of pesticide that was applied in the state. We know when it was applied, where it was applied, what crop it was used on, and what pesticides were used. And we're able to make these maps, like you can see there, that really show you where the agricultural regions of the state are and where the heavy pesticide use is. And let's see if this works. There. Oops. Here you can see there's a small valley right here, a lot of red. Red is the highest pesticide use. That's the Salinas Valley where we do our work. This is a close-up, actually, of the Salinas Valley, and you can really see how intensive the pesticide use is there. Salinas Valley is known as the salad bowl of the nation. We grow about half of the lettuce for the entire country, strawberries, broccoli, cauliflowers, but it's all, a lot of this low crops, salad crops predominantly. So our study is called the Center for the Health Assessment of Mothers and Children of Salinas, which is a really long name and nobody calls it that. We call it the Chamaco study, and chamacos means kids in Mexican Spanish, which really reflects the population that we work with. And you can see it's 1998 to the present. Edith mentioned earlier this morning there was a set of studies that were funded by NIEHS in the mid-90s that really had built into them that they would have a CBPR focus, and ours was one of those children's centers that started back in the 90s, just like Edith's did. So the objectives of our study are to estimate sources, pathways, and levels of pesticide exposure, really specifically to mothers and children. And then to determine how these pesticide exposures are influencing the health of mothers and children. And then also equally important in all of this is ways that we can actually reduce these exposures within our community. So what we did is in 1999 and 2000, we enrolled 601 pregnant women who were attending prenatal care at clinics serving the farm worker community, and they're very representative of the California farm worker community. You can see they're almost all Spanish speaking. Most of them were born in Mexico. Most of them are recent immigrants. They are low education, low income, and you can see that 44% of the women that we enrolled that were just happened to be pregnant women attending these clinics worked in agriculture themselves during their pregnancy, and even if they didn't work in agriculture themselves, most of them were living with other agricultural workers in their homes. And what we've done is a longitudinal birth cohort study. So we enrolled these women in 1999 and 2000, and we've been following them now for 18 years. So we were there when the babies were born in the hospital, and then we've brought them in every 6 months in the beginning, every 2 years now, and our kids are actually 18 years old right now. We just finished our 16-year visit, and we're starting our 18-year visit. What we do each time we see them, we do about a 3-hour assessment with them each time. We do an interview with the moms. We do about 2 hours of neurodevelopmental testing on the kids. We get height, weight, blood pressure on the kids, asthma symptoms, and lung function we've done in the past. And then between the ages of 9 and 14, we actually did clinical Tanner staging on the kids to see where they were through stages of puberty. And we've collected a lot of biological specimens. So from the very beginning, we've collected urine samples, blood samples, we collected breast milk, we collected the children's teeth. When they lost their teeth, we were the tooth fairy, and we would take 1 or 2 of those teeth samples so that we could measure chemical exposures. And all of these things, we have over 150,000 stored samples now. These are all different ways that we could measure. We started looking at pesticide exposure, and we've done a lot of work on pesticide exposure. Over the years, we've started looking at other environmental chemicals too. So as I mentioned, this is a CBPR project, and one of the rules when we applied for this center was that it had to be community-based project. And so when we went into this back in the 90s, we had a bunch of questions that we were asking ourselves. And the first question is, what are the principles of this partnership? What did we want the principles to be when we started? And this is what we kind of call our commandments. We sort of joke about it, but we're not joking. These are what we set out at the beginning and things that have really been important to us over the last 18 years, what we really wanted to be true to in our research. So things like to give back to the community more than we take, to be culturally sensitive and appropriate. You can read all of these. Some important things to employ and train community members. So all of our staff are bilingual and bicultural and from the community. And they have been an incredible resource to us. We have a community advisory board too, but some of the best information we get is coming from our staff because they really understand the population and understand the community. And then I also want to point out to share study results with the community in a timely manner. That's something that we really feel really strongly about. We don't want anybody reading in the newspaper about what our study found. We want to make sure that we've told them first before it gets, they come across it some other way. The next question, I think Edith brought this up this morning, is, or somebody did, who represents the community? And we had a lot of thought about this and talked to a lot of key informants and key people in the community. We started by talking with representatives who worked with the farm workers, the lawyers, and the other people that worked with the farm workers. We talked to the health and the social service agencies that are in our community. We talked with farm workers themselves, and all of those people are part of our community advisory board. But one decision that we made is that we also brought to the table the industry. So the agricultural commissioner for our county sits on our community advisory board, and we have 1 or 2 representatives from the industry that also sit on our advisory board. And this was a decision that we made. It's not necessarily the right decision for all communities, but we felt like we needed to have everybody in the community at the table if we really wanted to make a change in this community. And it's been difficult. Certainly in the beginning, we had people that were actively suing each other sitting at the table. They never sat at the table together except when they came to our community advisory board meetings. And over the years, they've gotten more civil, and they've kind of gotten used to each other. But that is a difficulty. But I think it was the right decision for us in order to be able to really make a difference in the community. We actually have an advisory board structure that includes the CAB, but because we have some power dynamics and some language dynamics on our CAB, we also have these sort of sub-councils. So we have a farm worker council that we don't convene, we convene as needed. So this is just farm workers. It's obviously done in Spanish and is a more comfortable place, I think, for people to speak than necessarily the entire CAB. Similarly, we have a growers council where there are things that we need the buy-in of the growers. So we would meet with them separately. And then there's the scientific advisory board, and there's another council here. As you saw, we're a large longitudinal cohort study, and as our kids were getting to be 10, 11, 12 years old, we realized that there was a part of our community that was not represented, and that was kids, the youth themselves. As they were entering teenage years, we wanted to make sure that we also had a youth voice, and I'll talk about that later in my presentation, but that's when we started our youth community council also. So what was the role of the community in our partnership? And this was something that we talked with our community partners about to decide what this would look like. And one of the things that was really clear for them was that they wanted it to be bidirectional learning. They were correct, and they recognized that there was a lot that we could learn from them. And they wanted to learn from us too. They wanted to make sure that they were understanding what we were finding and that the results were shared with them. They said they wanted to have an advisory role. That was kind of the level of involvement that they wanted. And this was really key for them. They said no surprises. They wanted to be kept up to date on everything that we were doing, everything that we were finding, really make sure that they were part of that communication process. And then the last one is, what are the researchers' obligations to the community? And I'll talk about that as we go on, but one of the things that really made sense to us was that we did community outreach, which included returning our results, but also you saw that one of our primary aims was how can we actually reduce these exposures in this community? So education, intervention, and outreach. Oh, and this is a picture of one of our community meetings that we hold community meetings every year to tell our this is just for our study participants, but to bring the participant families in so that they can learn what we've found in the last year and what we'll be doing in the next year. These are all held in Spanish. There's food, there's music, there's door prizes, different things to make it an interesting event and to get people to come. So in terms of the science, what we did, as I mentioned, we looked at a lot of different pesticides and a lot of different chemicals. I'm going to talk just really briefly about our organophosphate pesticide findings. We determine pesticide exposure in our community in 5 different ways. So you can see that we interview the moms and just learn about the different behaviors in the family and farm workers, if they're wearing shoes in the house, that kind of thing. We've done home inspections where we actually see what home-use pesticides they have in their home. We take dust samples to measure pesticides in the dust. We have these maps that I showed you at the beginning, so we know what's being used throughout the state and throughout our valley. And then we do biomarkers. So we've taken urine samples and blood samples and used that as a way to measure what the actual internal dose of the pesticides are. And just some really quick findings, but just to show you, when we looked at our exposure studies, when we looked in the dust, more than 82%, or about 82% of houses had organophosphate pesticides, chlorpyrifos and diazinon, and then many other pesticides were also found in the house, just to show that the majority of houses did have pesticides in them, in the dust. And we also, as I mentioned, looked at metabolites in urine and found that the moms in our study had higher levels compared to the general US population. But one of the questions that was really important to us is, are these exposures related to health and development of children? We've published more than 150 studies, papers on this study, so I'm not going to tell you very many details, but I'll just give you a few highlights. One of the most important things I think that we've published is our association of organophosphate pesticides in utero, prenatal exposure to the moms, and brain development in the children. So to orient you to this slide, this is the beta coefficient for the drop in mental development associated with a 10-fold increase in the mom's pesticide levels in urine during pregnancy, and this is the confidence interval. So at 6 months and at 1 year, you see that we're seeing a drop in IQ of about 1.5 points, but not statistically significant. But by the time our kids are 2 years old, we're seeing about a 3.5 point drop in IQ in mental development, and that's statistically significant. And that shows up again when they're 3.5. And by 5, we have a significant 6-point decrease in IQ for each 10-fold increase in the mom's metabolites during pregnancy, controlling for many other factors. It's really hard to measure brain development on babies, but as they get older, it gets easier and more valid. By the time they're 7 years old, we can do a full IQ test on them. These are school-age kids. And what we're measuring here is full-scale IQ, which is broken up into 4 different domains. And you can see across the board, we're seeing about a 4-point, more or less, decrease in IQ with the mom's increasing prenatal exposure in each of the 4 domains and in the full-scale IQ. This is just another way of looking at the same thing. At age 7, we divided the moms into 3 different groups of low, medium, and high pesticide exposure, and you can see that on average we're seeing a lower IQ as the levels increase. And similarly, this is now looking at attention problems. You can see with higher prenatal exposure, we see more attention problems, more ADHD kind of problems, and that's statistically significant. And we're also seeing autism-related behaviors, so decreased social skills at age 7 and decreased autism spectrum traits at age 14, again with prenatal exposure. And the thing that's really important here is what we see is it's about what the moms are experiencing during pregnancy, because we're measuring pesticides on the kids as they're growing up, but we're not seeing the same kind of associations. We're not really seeing any associations with mental development in the kids. It's really what's happening to the moms when she's pregnant is affecting the children's brain development as they're getting older. Of course, kids and everybody, it's not just about pesticides. We live in a complicated social environment. So one of the things, and again, this kind of came out of our community, is they're saying these kids are growing up in a lot of difficult circumstances besides just the pesticides. And we're seeing things in terms of the larger environment. Poverty is a big thing, violence and discrimination. And so one of the questions we were asking is, how are these also interacting? And one of the things that we found is that the effects of these organophosphate pesticides on brain development are stronger and have more early life adversity. So for example, among kids with low family adversity, the OPs were associated with a 2.5-point decrease in IQ, and that wasn't statistically significant. But when you look at the kids with high family adversity, you're seeing an 8.2-point decrease in IQ that was statistically significant. So what we're seeing is these kids are getting kind of a double whammy. They're having the effects of the pesticides, they're having the effects of these stressors on their lives, and it doesn't just put them at double jeopardy, it puts them at triple jeopardy, because those two things together are more than their individual sums. Just one other thing in terms of health effects that we found is OP pesticide exposure is also associated with more asthma symptoms, respiratory symptoms in kids. Especially when we're looking at the children's exposure this time rather than the prenatal exposure. It's about a 1.7 increase in odds for prenatal exposure, but it's about 2.5 for the kids. So this time it was more about that early life exposure on respiratory development. But these are just really important findings that were, for us, important to get out into the scientific literature, but also to get out to policymakers, get out to our community, and also to incorporate it into our educational activities. But as I mentioned, our ultimate goal is to reduce families' pesticide exposure, and we're doing this on the individual level, community level, and the policy level. We found when we were talking to the farm workers that really there was a lot of them weren't getting pesticide safety training, even though it's required by law. 42% of them said they never had it. They didn't know when pesticides were applied. They didn't know what was applied. But we knew that they worried that the pesticides could be impacting their family's health. We did an intervention in the fields, and this one we really worked closely with our Farm Worker Council to design what intervention would really be effective. And what we learned, what we decided to do is give them gloves to wear. We learned from our Farm Worker Council that they don't like washing their hands in cold water when they've been working, because if you're hot and you wash your hands in cold water, they were always told that would give you arthritis, and so we put a flash water heater in so that they could have hot water. You actually just fill a tank and the hot water goes to the fields, but it stays warm in the tank. Taught them how to use the hand washing system, provided them with lightweight coveralls. The women wanted something for modesty to wrap around their waist, so we did that. And then we had a laundry service to pick up and drop off the coveralls. And we also did some field-based education. And some of the findings that we found, particularly with the gloves, we found that first when we looked at the pesticides on their hands, when they were, this is strawberry workers, strawberry pickers, when they weren't wearing the gloves, we found pretty high levels of the pesticides when they weren't wearing gloves. And when they were, it would really seem to be keeping the pesticides off their hands. And we also found that they had lower levels of pesticide metabolites in their urine, in their bodies. So it was also seemed to be keeping them out of their bodies. We've done in-home education also. Again, this is really focused on working with farm workers to decrease the exposure to their children. One of the things that we've found is that that's a good incentive, right? If you're trying to tell a farm worker to wear protective equipment to protect himself, he's not as interested. But when you say, okay, but this could affect your children, that gives them more of an incentive to listen and to make change. We do puppet shows. Again, we've found that working with kids is a really great medium to teach them the message that they then can say the same message to their parents. And parents are more likely to not ignore it when it's their children telling them to take off their shoes, for example, when they come into the house. And also I showed a picture before of our community meetings. And then the last thing I just want to talk quickly about is I mentioned that we started a youth council. This is about 8 years ago now. Our youth council isn't just there to advise our work. We've really felt like this was a great opportunity to sort of bring up the next generation of environmental health leaders. So this is a leadership training program. And what's great about this particular youth council, we've done about 4 of them now, these kids are all participants in the Chamaco study. So they were in our study since before they were born. And now they are working for us as youth council members. We did a study with them. This was a youth participatory action research study where we wanted to learn about pesticide exposure to teenagers in the community. We used the wristbands. Actually, Carolyn, I think, is the one that analyzed them to measure their pesticide exposure. This is 100 teenage girls that we enrolled. We took dust samples and urine samples from them. All of this research was actually done by the teenagers, so they were 15, 16 years old, and we hired them for the summer, and they were the ones that did all the interviewing. You can see one of our interviewers right there working with the participant. They took the dust samples. And they found, we've published some of these results now. In terms of what was in the wristbands, we found some things that were predictors of wristband levels, including living closer to crops. But the things that the youth really liked were that there were some positive things. So that if you had a doormat in front of your house, you had lower levels in your wristband than if you didn't. And if your house was cleaned daily, you also had lower levels. So these were things that they really kind of grasped on that could make a difference in their community, and a message that they could say that was a more positive message. In fact, one of the messages that they really wanted to get out there was the doormats, and they convinced me with our grant money to buy 4,000 doormats, which we've been handing out in the community. This says in Spanish, yes, it says, "Don't track pesticides into your home, wipe your feet, and take off your shoes." And the other thing that's great about working with youth is they're really good at getting the message out there. So we hired them after they did their study the one summer. The next 2 summers, they came back and worked for us to do community outreach and education and advocacy. And we let them decide what they wanted to do. And one of the things they wanted to do was radio announcements. They said that what was really popular for the farm workers was listening to Spanish music on the radio when they're in the fields. And what's also really popular in the community is these soap operas. So they wanted to do a soap opera on the radio that was about a woman who keeps getting exposed to pesticides and telling her what she can do. And it's very dramatic, and they acted it out. We have 8 different shows. They're about 1 minute long, each one, and they're playing now on 10 radio stations throughout the western United States, on the Spanish language radio stations. And they've been interviewed on the news, because everybody likes to hear a good story about teenagers that are doing good work. So the news stations love them. And they also, in their community, these murals are very popular. So they worked with a local artist to design a mural that just tells the message, and without using words, tells the message of how you can protect yourself from pesticides. There's some close-up of our mural. It's actually very beautiful, and it's going up in the mall, which is a place where people spend a lot of time. So that's where I'm going to end, but I just want to say that as a CBPR project, we've educated more than 30,000 farm workers and their families about how to reduce pesticide exposure, in addition to doing our epidemiologic research and our published papers. And I'm going to end there.